see into the unreality of this self that we cling to, and liberate oneself from the afflictive emotions. This book uses the terms conflicting emotions, I think, and conflicting emotions means more than just emotions. So the English misleads us a little bit. The Sanskrit term is kleshas, and it refers to basically the upsetting or painful or disturbing or distracting emotions that we have, but also our delusive thoughts. They're considered kleshas too. So in the practice of basically rejecting these afflictions, because really the world, samsara, is this wheel that's turning, and the energy is those afflictions. People in reaction to the afflictions that they experience. So it's mind driven. And it's said that even our very bodies ourselves are the results of past practice of the afflictions, and also the virtuous things that we've done too. So it's not just a one-way street, so to speak. But basically, these afflictions motivate us, and we're living in a reactive mode where afflictions arise. We don't recognize them as afflictions per se. We obviously experience the power of them, and it's like they colonize the mind. I mean, they take it over, and we do sort of a knee-jerk reaction, or sometimes even worse, a studied kind of reaction. It's like resentments, holding on to anger in a continuous kind of way is very destructive. But the immediate flash of anger and the activities, the hatred that comes out of that, the negative activities, this is creating karma. And again, as you know, karma just means action. So the differing ways of dealing with our afflictive emotions define the different great divisions of the Buddha Dharma. Something that's very powerful about what's called Tibetan Buddhism is that it has preserved and practiced and realized over centuries the full range of Buddha's teachings. And this example that was given by my old mind is fading. Kensei, one of the Kensei Rinpoches, forgive me. But nonetheless, with the self-liberation practice, it's like the practitioner is symbolized as a monk wandering through a forest of poisonous trees. And these poisonous trees have fruit. And the fruit of these poisonous trees are our afflictive emotions. And the monk is walking through, and the practice in this way is just to simply don't go there. You don't touch or eat or get involved with the poisonous fruit. In fact, what you're doing is you take an axe and you chop down the tree, the mind states that are producing, you might say, those afflictive emotions. You can think of it too as chopping down the afflictive emotions themselves at the root. So what is this axe? Well, one, it's very heavy axe. It has a lot of momentum with it, and that heaviness is our concentration practice. So that's what's giving the power to our practice, is just the non-distractedness of the mind. And of course, we have to train ourselves in this, because our whole shtick is just distractions. So that's the weight, but the sharpness of the axe is vipassana. That's the correct view, seeing into the nature of the mind experientially, but even before that, having this understanding, for instance, that the afflictions are poison, basically. So with that axe, the monk chops down the poisonous tree, and we just don't get involved with the afflictive emotions at all. And that's what we're going through tonight in this part of the book. Then, just to give a little foretaste, In the conventional Mahayana, which is what probably we'll start with next week, this is a different way of practicing with the emotions. I mean, notice that the emotions, these afflictive emotions, are the stuff of practice. So it's not a matter of suppressing these mind states as they arise, or thinking of ourselves as somehow deficient because they are arising. Instead, it's the great courageous honesty of the Dharma that you are engaged with your own mind. It's just like the paradox of paradox, that the whole world is running around with people who aren't even in touch with their own mind and don't recognize the power of the mind. You know, it's said that the answer is there, but of course, no one's looking there. Everyone's looking out. So this practice of abandoning the afflictive emotions leads to the state of arhathood. Arhat means conqueror. That's someone who has completely conquered the afflictive emotions, and there's no more suffering like that. You've attained liberation. It's obviously a very profound state. And although the motivation is limited, because we're talking about self-liberation, nothing wrong with that. I mean, good grief, we have to start somewhere for one thing. And the states that can be attained are, said to be definitely profound, but also until a very high level of the bodhisattva accomplishment. Until a very high level, the individual practitioner is more deeply realized than someone on the bodhisattva path. So that's why the self-liberation path is never denigrated. I'm told that sometimes happens in a very ignorant kind of way. I don't know if it does anymore, but I'm told it did happen in Japan, say in the 1950s, that you'd have a politician then running for office, and they'd criticize their opponent as a Hinayanist. That's not the Buddhist way. To continue the metaphor, so the next is said to be walking through the same poisonous forest. But now the method changes with the conventional Mahayana. So instead of chopping down the tree, we now pick the fruit, and we take a little bit of the fruit, and sort of like homeopathy, we use it to make a medicine, the opposite. So we use the stimulus of recognizing, because again, with mindfulness, we're now recognizing these states as they arise. But instead of just running away from it, just abandoning it on the spot, instead we use it to practice its antidote. And so there are many things to learn, but nonetheless, when anger arises, you're stimulated and trained to practice patience. When greed arises, we train ourselves and recognize and then practice satisfaction. And there are tremendous, teachings that allow us to explore this and to see why this makes sense and why this actually comports with reality and is not some sort of artificial hat that we're trying to wear, or some sort of, something that's in violation of reality that we're trying to do. So again, it's making an antidote, and we're practicing the antidote. This is the conventional Mahayana. Then going through the same tree in the Vajrayana, or the extraordinary Mahayana level of practice, you're walking through the same poisonous forest, but now the practice is to actually take a bite, to pick the fruit and take a bite of it. And this, of course, assumes that you have the understanding of the poisonous nature of the afflictions, that they're not things that should be taking you over, or that you revel in and think that somehow happiness is going to come out of actions that are stimulated by the afflictive emotions themselves. And you also have the understanding that patience, for instance, and all the antidotes, that this is the path to Buddhahood, the conventional Mahayana. But now you're looking at the very essence, you might say, the nature of the afflictions themselves. And all of this is seen to be, you might say, a projection of mind. And this is pure vision, the pure vision of the Vajrayana, which of course includes, Guru Yoga and Dzogchen and Mahamudra, with that view, very close to that view. So, at any rate, the self-liberation path is so important because it allows us to free ourselves from the afflictions, which are the cause of so much dissatisfaction and pain in our very lives, and also have the ability to, through the magic of cause and effect, to result in future suffering also. The other thing is that, even though we're not stepping into the Mahayana yet, but when that happens, the knowledge of the afflictions is so valuable in dealing with other human beings, because you see that process, you've seen that process in yourself, you've seen how it betrays you again and again and again, the ignorant following or reactive states to the afflictions. And so because you've seen it in yourself, you can see it in others. And there, it's a very profound way of helping others, just that you understand what's going on with them in an experiential way, in a way that you've tested in your own mind again and again and again, and in a way that you've seen your own failings, stumbling with it. So you've experienced the power of the afflictive emotions. And then more, the power of distractions. It's just amazing. It's just amazing. And you've seen how this appears to us as a solid reality, as an absolute reality. The nature of ignorance is so cruel because clearly we just don't see it. I think one of the interesting things about ourselves is often we don't see our own stuff, so to speak, but our friends do. Sometimes I think that's the definition of a friend, that they will put up with stuff that we don't see. So it says in Shantideva, and Dalai Lama says this all the time, of course, that our enemies are actually our greatest teachers. Because unlike a friend, an enemy won't put up with our malarkey. Instead, will reveal it. And of course, that's very painful. But when you see it, then we can do something with it. And of course, that's the great power of meditation, is that you see it. You can't run away from it. So on this path of rejecting the emotions, abandoning the emotions, he's going to touch, Kala Rinpoche first touches on the four attentions, and then there'll be more on this, a little detail in just a few minutes. To rid oneself of attachment and all concern for the body, the practitioner of self-liberation retires to a solitary place to devote himself or herself to meditation. Meditation is founded on the complete four attentions, which is the complete attention to the body, the complete attention to sensations, the complete attention to the mind, and the complete attention to phenomenon. By the practice of these four attentions, the mind stabilizes itself. These attentions constitute what is called mental calming, shamatha in Sanskrit, shine in Tibetan. The mind focuses on one object without being carried away by grasping any thought, whatever it might be, or by any conflicting emotion. The mind remains perfectly at rest. I was talking to someone Sunday about this understanding of calming meditation, about the shamatha or shine meditation. Again, it's very helpful because then you suddenly see that you have the power of this to practice this in any situation. So for instance, when we're practicing on the breath, there's this very useful, you might say, and available object of concentration. What can we focus on? Well, the breath itself. The breath is great because, one, it happens even when we're unconscious or asleep. It's a natural process that we don't have to force it. You just let it happen and you can concentrate on it. So it's always there. It's kind of a natural support, and we don't have to arbitrarily kind of, create something else. So that's great. But this object of concentration, works for us. The practice of calming the mind works even in study when we're concentrating on a particular topic. But certainly, even in the great mandalas and the great visions and the visionary practices of the Vajrayana, focusing on the visualized experience is shamatha. One of the powers, obviously we're getting ahead of the story, but one of the reasons that the Vajrayana is so powerful is that it combines concentration and vipassana, awareness practice. It combines it together. And so that's really a remarkable thing. There's a kind of the unity of the mind is right there in the very practice itself. Whereas right now in the self-liberation, it's kind of an arbitrary process that we're doing. But it's arbitrary because the mind is so lost in so much distraction that we need something to kind of cling to. So you have an object of meditation and the mindfulness practice. And again, I'm told that both in Tibetan and Sanskrit, what gets translated as mindfulness in English has the root or the radical for remembering. So it's this process where we have an object of meditation, can just be a stone, a Buddha figure, the breath, it can be various things. But nonetheless, we're just letting the mind rest on that object. And of course, what happens? There are distractions. There's either agitation, we're thinking about all sorts of things, and the mind is kind of in an excited state of one way or another. And so we lose awareness of the object of meditation. But then the mindfulness, the remembering kicks in. And there we go. We remember the object of meditation, bring our mind back to it, and it's doing that again and again and again and again. At the same time, we're practicing the awareness of the object itself. I mean, just in resting the mind on it, the mind is naturally aware. And Garam Rinpoche has said that it's like the practice of the awareness practice is when you realize that you've forgotten the object of meditation, whether through excitation or dullness. So, you're just spacing out. If you're counting your breaths, for instance, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10, suddenly you find yourself at 35, you've lost awareness. Finding that you're lacking awareness is awareness. And so you bring it back to the object of meditation. And Garam Rinpoche has said it's like a burning stick of incense. That nub, that burning nub, gets put on the distraction and just gone. So it's this seemingly artificial practice of training the mind by having an object of meditation and resting our mind on that. And when it goes away, we just keep bringing it back. That's all there is to it. So this tremendous training of the mind. Now, there are many practices that it's sort of the core principle, but then things build from that, working on different aspects and helpful different aspects of the mind. So the first of the 4 complete attentions is attention dealing with the body. It is based on the fact that we identify ourselves with our body. In this method, the mind focuses on the simple feeling to be the body without adding such judgments or appreciations as this body is a good thing or it is a bad thing, it is pleasant or it is painful, it is healthy or not healthy, it exists or it does not exist, and so on. We are open only to the feeling of having a body without distraction. This approach includes many methods. The one we just read is only one of them. And here too, this multiplicity of methods is something that kind of overwhelms a lot of us. Whether it's Vajrasattva, whether it's, this weekend with Jiravka, teaching on Tonglen. How many different examples did she give of Tonglen? Principle is the same. Sometimes this throws people. It's like we want simplicity. We want one thing to do, and you have so many examples or methods, and sometimes this throws people a little bit. Like either they have to feel that they have to learn all of them, or they think that they have to find the right one for them, or whatever, kind of lost in the multiplicities. But of course you don't. You don't. It's just that there are 84,000 different types of sentient beings, 84,000 different delusions, and to have methods that sort of counteract each one of them is actually a very helpful thing. So this is broad, it's about all sentient beings. Through the body, different sensations are felt: cold or heat, softness or roughness, and so on. Whatever sensation we perceive, again without judgment, the mind remains concentrated on it without distraction. This is the complete second attention, the complete attention of the sensations. The third attention focuses on the experiences of the mind, joy or displeasure, happiness or suffering, or any type of mental response. We are simply open to these responses without developing any thought whatever, or without following them either. We just observe them in a neutral manner. Finally, attention to phenomenon is done in the same way, concentrating on forms, sounds, smells, and so on. For example, when a form is perceived by the eyes, we try not to divert our attention. We neither judge it nor make a comment such, "This is beautiful," "This is not," "I like it," or "I do not like it." We simply maintain a mind focused on the perceived object without distraction, just simply present. We do the same practice for a sound, a smell, or any other object of sense. In this type of meditation, it is necessary to understand that the notion of mind applies to the present. All that has already happened in the mind is no longer there. What will take place is not yet here. Past and future are not real. The mind in the present is not marked by time. The mind has no material reality, no color, no form, no size, and so on. In this way, mind is emptiness, and we try to dwell constantly in this emptiness. He then talks about something called the 4 right renouncements. After having performed these complete 4 attentions, the practitioner approaches the 4 right renouncements, which are on a moral level, becoming aware of negative actions already committed. In order to reject them as unwholesome, the practitioner undertakes not to act this way in the future. Furthermore, the practitioner tries to emphasize positive tendencies that have already arisen and to engender those that have not yet arisen. And you see in these how some of our morning prayers are just like exactly on this. This is what it's being repeated again and again and again. Then he has a little section here that is interesting that I have not come across before, called Becoming Fire. Another element of the self-liberation approach is the 4 miraculous foundations. This means that reaching certain capacities of concentration leads to the attainment of extraordinary powers. Those having reached these capacities meditate on the element fire with such strength that their bodies are effectively perceived as ablaze. If they meditate on the water element, their bodies will be perceived as an expanse of water. This same kind of wonder happens by concentrating on the wind or the earth element. This is why in the history of the Arhats and solitary Buddhas of the past, we encounter many examples of beings who have transformed into a sphere of fire, into a mass of water, or into beams of light at the moment of dying. So this is very interesting because, again, we're talking about self-liberation, and you can see sort of the extraordinary side effects you might see of this meditation, and also puts one in a humble state rather than labeling ourselves as Mahayanas and looking down on the supposed self-liberation practice, to realize, the greatness of the attainment here. Now, the end stage of this, the end result, is the Arhat, as opposed to a Buddha. One is an arhat at the final accomplishment of this type of practice. And he says the goal of self-liberation is to reach the stage of an arhat in which no thought or conflicting emotion arises. The mind resides in a united and pacified manner without activity during a period traditionally determined to be 84,000 kalpas. This is daunting, when you get into these numbers and concepts of the relative teachings, the conventional teachings. There's an unfortunate tendency to sort of skip away from them because it just seems so fantastical. But of course, it's pointing out the inconceivability of the nature of our mind. So a kalpa, I don't really know it very well. There are different levels of kalpas. There are small kalpas, medium kalpas, great kalpas. I don't know which one this is supposedly talking about, but it said that if you had a mountain made out of solid iron that was a mile high, and then there was an angel that flew once a year, and its wings touched the tip of the iron mountain in that one flight. A kalpa is the amount of time it would take to wear down that iron mountain. So it's kind of daunting. But nonetheless, he's saying that the mind resides in an united and pacified manner without activity during a period traditionally determined to be 84,000 kalpas. No suffering is experienced, nor is any particular feeling. It's a kind of absolute calm. From the viewpoint of Mahayana, this stage is not considered as definitive. It is an individual liberation up to the end of 84,000 kalpas, when the experience is magnified by the intervention of a Buddha focusing a beam of light on the arhat. By the effect of this light, the arhat's consciousness becomes clearer. The vision of immense suffering of beings arises, as well as the wish to liberate and establish them in peace and happiness. Compassion is born. The arhat then engages on the path of Mahayana and quickly reaches the bodhisattva stage. Practicing the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections, he or she goes through the 10 levels of a bodhisattva and finally obtains Buddhahood. The stage of arhat has great value since it allows one to reside in a state where there is no suffering and to remain in perfect peace and happiness for an extremely long period of time. However, it has one defect, that of not taking account of others' suffering. The mind is absorbed in its own peace without remembrance of the general condition of all beings. In actual practice, the self-liberation tradition emphasizes withdrawing from the world and rejecting all the pleasures of the senses, preparing oneself for an austere and simple life, restraining as much as possible the activity of body and speech. Solitude and contentment are the 2 main virtues. The meditation of this tradition encompasses mental calming, shamatha, and superior vision. So in Sanskrit, vipassana, Tibetan, latong. Although the latter is envisioned with an appreciably different manner in the Mahayana. So there's a difference between the teachings of vipassana, special seeing in Tibetan, latong, a difference between the self-liberation, vipassana, and the Mahayana. In the Hinayana, in self-liberation, mental calming uses several methods with or without support and is not different from methods taught in the Mahayana tradition. So the basic difference is going to come down to this difference in motivation, difference in view, which again points to the creative power and the fundamental power of the mind. Okay, now a living tradition. The monastic tradition in self-liberation appeared at the time of the historical Buddha. It continued for centuries with little modification, is very much alive in Sri Lanka, Burma, and Thailand. Monks have kept to an austere lifestyle, contented to eat and dress in what is offered them. They do not engage in worldly activity. They go out in the morning with their begging bowls and seem to live exactly as the monks of ancient India. During my own travels in these countries, I have seen monks representing such a wonderful tradition. In Southeast Asia, monks and nuns live in an environment respectful of their rules and in a social structure that completely supports them. It is agreed by all people, for example, that a monk must not have physical contact with a person of the other sex, and that he cannot even shake hands with this person. Monks, as well as women, perfectly respect this rule. Nevertheless, supposing that for one reason or another a monk is obliged to touch a woman, he will first cover his hand with fabric. By doing so, he will not forget his monkhood. The general population gives a lot of strength to monastic values. In Burma and Thailand, many monks live in the forest, isolated in hermitages that they never leave. They never visit a village and have no contact with anyone. Their living is ensured by lay benefactors who deposit necessities in front of the monk's hut or cave. And so this happens, to this day in these countries. We had one friend here in Rochester who went to Burma. He's living in a little hut somewhere in this forest in Burma. Isolation is sometimes the chosen solution to social or family conflicts. Instead of residing in an environment producing tension, this person chooses to become separate and is no longer in a position of hearing or talking about conflicts. Cutting off the world, the person chooses to live in a hermitage and practice meditation. In the West, most people often prefer to confront the situation in order to try to solve conflicts. In the East, they sometimes prefer total disengagement. Now, he's going to speak in a little more detail on this practice of the four attentions. And you will recognize this because these are the four mindfulnesses, sometimes called. And although I haven't been there, I understand this to be the main practice of what's called the Vipassana traditions in America. These are traditions that came from Burma and Thailand, and to some degree Sri Lanka. These were modern monks in the late 1800s and early 20th century, 1900s, who very much revivified their traditions, which had been weakening for sure. I mean, I think some of these cultures in Asia, they were overwhelmed by colonialism and all of that, historic change that they experienced. And I had read that, for instance, there were Englishmen and women in the Pali Society, for instance, started in England. These were British colonialists who came across the teachings of the Buddha and were inspired by it, intrigued by it. So, for instance, there's this figure, Sir William Jones, who was a colonial administrator in India, and he was a great language scholar. He was the one that basically discovered Sanskrit for the European peoples. And it was his understanding from this study, because he knew so many other languages such as Greek, Latin for sure, and then Romance languages, and of course English, that he had the understanding that Sanskrit was like their progenitor. So you see, we say this, for instance, like the word video, to see in Latin. And of course we have the word video and meaning really same, vidya in Sanskrit. So he saw these, these cognates, the word for mother, and but many other words there that we recognize. So this was a tremendous discovery, because Europe really knew nothing of all of this. And then suddenly there were people, especially in England, who were valuing Buddhism, and even they hadn't distinguished it from the other Indian traditions at that point. And even Emerson and Thoreau, they read some of the first translations in the French of Buddhist sutras. And so the transcendentalists were influenced by Buddhism. We generally don't know these things. My point being here is that when these people who had been colonized saw the colonizers having respect for their indigenous traditions, it revivified them. And there are several great monks in Burma and Thailand who basically are the progenitors of what's called the Vipassana movement in America. And, they've done tremendous work. So it's basically these practices that they do, as far as my understanding is, the practice of the four attentions. To acquire an idea of the approach of the meditation in the self-liberation, it is best that we practice together the four complete attentions previously mentioned. First, let us practice attention to the body. We become conscious of thinking, I am the body, isolating the body from the context of attachment and desire that is usually associated with it. We remain without any other thought, and if a thought does appear, we immediately cut its stream. We pay attention to the body without adding anything else and without distraction. And you can see how difficult this is. I mean, really profound, really. Because our ordinary situation, we are unaware of our body, really. We're going around, but again, we're reacting to. There's something that appeals to the body. There's something that threatens the body. There's uncomfortable with the body. We're always in this reactive state. But to just rest in the awareness of the body, the feeling of I am the body, is not an easy thing. It's a very difficult kind of object of meditation, much more so than, again, a blue stone or a Buddha figure or the breath. So sometimes the breath practices and these things are used to, calm the mind down to the point where we have enough mental control that we can do these kinds of practices. All right. Let us now consider the attention to sensations. It can be a sensation of cold or warmth, a cramp, a pain in a certain part of our body, or an itchiness. It can be unpleasant or pleasant. Whatever sensation is perceived, the mind stays fixed on it without following any other thought. We are not obliged to limit ourselves to a single sensation. If one disappears and another arises, we pass from one to the other. We do not try to select a sensation over another, but concentrate on the strongest one. For example, we can feel more particularly the warmth than an itchiness. We discard the first sensation for the second one. And this is the meditation. So now we're just reading through this, but you can see this as a kind of like a guided practice that people can do. You can spend time and then in the same session, you can move on to doing the awareness of sensations. The third type of complete attention is attention to the mind. In this case, we do not refer to an external object, but to what happens inwardly, to all expressions of the mind, thoughts, emotions, memories, and so on. The meditation consists in simply being aware of these mental productions without engaging ourselves in the content. If the mind dwells in a state of rest and at peace, we remain aware of this state without doing anything. When thoughts arise, we do not encourage them, particularly if they are good, as those generated by devotion or compassion, no more than we try to chase them away if they are negative, such as those provoked by irritation, anger, desire, and so on. We are aware only of what happens without intervening to maintain a thought or stop it. And you can see, the powerful meditation that this is too, because, my experience, and I think I am an outstanding worldly being, those thoughts are, so powerful. You do attach to them. And then the train goes on of, I'll do this, then I'll do this, and what if this, you're completely lost in it. So to use those thoughts that are, again, they're not the problem in meditation, but they often appear to us as, the problem because we're distracted. You can see this is really, like a deep meditation, and yet dealing with the stuff that we naturally have where we're at right now. Finally, the fourth mode of attention is directed towards external phenomena, as those perceived by our different senses. In reality, the totality of what manifests, such as the perceiving mind, the bodily senses, and the external objects, constitute phenomenon. In this type of meditation, we direct attention toward the perceived object without adding any judgment. During this present meditation exercise, we may hear, for example, the noise of cars in the street. We can make it the object of our attention. We do not think that it is unpleasant or a pleasant noise, or whether it is disturbing or not. We are just present to the noise. I mean, think about that, because that's exactly what happens with us. We're meditating and a noise, the car noise comes up, and we immediately think that it's some sort of a problem. But if you put your mind on that sound, it becomes the object of meditation, and you're still practicing the calming the mind, the undistracted, but the object is changing, but your power, your awareness isn't. So, I mean, this, as you can see, to have practiced this for years is, remarkable practice. And so Kala Rinpoche continues, we now have seen completely the totality of these four attentions to the body, sensations, mind, and phenomenon. In these exercises, the most important factor is the mind itself. Once again, let us remember that we do not refer to something limited by form, color, size, or place. We cannot say my mind has a great or small size. Those are not characteristics that can be applied to the mind. The mind is what knows, feels, and produces thoughts, perceptions, and feelings. In meditation, we are not concerned with thoughts that have already been produced in the past or by those produced in the future, but only by what is immediately present to the mind. The mind has no side, front, or back, limit, color, and so on. Mind is empty. It is not a definable reality. So let us meditate now by simply dwelling on this indefinable mind. And he has his students meditate. There are books, I'm thinking of Buddhist thought in India, this great work that Edward Kanze has done. And when he talks about this word emptiness that we use, different levels of emptiness, you might say. I think there are Mahayana texts about the 18 different types of emptiness, for instance. But it's important to know that there's emptiness in self-liberation practice too. And what is it? Is that we are empty of self. And so all these practices are pointing at that. Because again, instead of giving this ultimate reality, you might say, to body, everything, focus, running through the body and the body's reactions to different things. Instead of this very first mindfulness practice, you're just on that feeling of I am the body. And so there's something there that is more fundamental, you might say. There's something there that is not tangled up in these reactions of the body, or the body as whatever, but just in the experience itself. These meditations lead us to change the perceptions we have of ourselves. We see our body as a bubble on the surface of water, our speech like an echo without its own reality, and our thoughts as a mirage. As for the external world, it appears to us as a totality of conditions harmful to our practice. Adopting the view, meditation, and manner of acting of the Hinayana, of the self-liberation, is to engage on a sure path that infallibly leads to liberation. This path releases us from suffering in this very existence and leads to the state of Arhat. Therefore, it has great value. He said in the beginning of our text here, you might remember, about how the social conditions in the West are so different from the East in this sense. The societal the support that is there for these kinds of practices, the practices of isolation and that, and the view that sustains them. is feeling that this is kind of a challenge in the West. Now, the Vipassana centers, as they're called, I think there are two great divisions here in the West. One come from I can't remember the Megan's teacher at Berkeley has written papers on the modern history of Buddhism in the West, including what we call Vipassana. There are basically two great differing traditions here. They have slightly different, I think, practices and attitudes. I don't really know much about it. So it's happening here in the West, even though we don't have this kind of societal support for monks and nuns, and the understanding of, withdrawal, living in a hut and that. Even though not here, this type of practice, I think, is producing a lot of good things. You can talk to the people who practice in this way. I think for us to understand that these self-liberation practices, excuse me, are totally contained within the Mahayana. It's always this, I think, this example of the Arhat, resting in this total peacefulness, but that at some point, as Kala Rinpoche taught, a Buddha appears to the mind of the Arhat, and light shines from the heart of that Buddha to the heart of the Arhat, and the Arhat wakes up to the sense that suddenly there's this intense awareness of the suffering of all the illusory sentient beings. And at the same time, this desire that's naturally there, when you see things as they really are, there's this natural desire to want to liberate those beings. Why? Because you know that they're not different than you, and they're a product of mind too, you might say, from one particular point of view. But the point is that this compassion is not an artificial or manufactured thing, but rather it's the nature of wisdom itself, as perceived by someone who is not fully enlightened, you might say. So there's this wanting to go further. The Tibetan said somewhere that there's you can cross the river once with self-liberation, and then you need to cross the river again to get to all the sentient beings, or like crossing a second river, I guess. But they say with the Mahayana, you're practicing from the beginning for sentient beings, even though we feel very limited in our ways with that, because we haven't developed this great peace and power of mind that the Arhat has. But nonetheless, the Tibetans say, why you can just cross the river once. You don't have to cross it twice. So why cross the river twice when you can cross it once? That's what they say. You don't have to feel discouraged by practicing these vast Mahayana practices because somehow you feel insufficient or something. It is true that, I've told the story, you've heard it, forgive me, but, when we first learned the Vajrasattva practice, and I did a weekend retreat, solitary retreat on Vajrasattva. And when it came to the end of the retreat and dissolving, the visualization, I realized I had spent the whole week. I didn't have any sentient beings in my visualization at all. It was like, it was all about I don't know what, but they weren't there. So that can be very discouraging, when you see just how inherently selfish we are. I mean, it's just like, damn, we're good at it. And yet this great teaching from the Mahayana is, not to be discouraged. There's no mistake. No one comes to this like in a mistaken way. There's something very profound and wonderful happening. But nonetheless, to read about the abandonment of the emotions is very helpful, because it's kind of our human state to be reveling in some way. Like Shantideva says, we just let these afflictions take over. Said our real enemies are not the problem. The afflictions are our real enemies, not the other beings. Okay, So we can stop there today as far as the text. Any questions or any comments from anyone this evening rather?
Hello. I had a couple as the night went on. I'm just going to say 84,000 kalpas, and we'll get back to that. And then what you just said about doing a full practice without having any sentient beings in mind. You've told me that story before, and I think it was relating to Vajrakalaya.
I think it was Vajrasattva for me. I've probably done the same thing with Vajrakalaya. I can confess.
So Zhuravka reminded us all this weekend that every single one of those practices, the very first mantra basically says that all sentient beings are in the mandala in an instant. So that saves us.
Yeah, right. right. And whether Vajrakalaya or Vajrasattva, all those sentient beings are in that mind. It's total bodhicitta, the mind of the deity.
Yeah.
So you really are saved. And forgive me, you're making me think of something. Again, that's one of the additional powers in a conceptual way that I've come to understand of the visualization practices. Because, again, my own experience, when you try to do these self-liberation type practices, man, does boredom come up. When you're trying to be on one, just boredom and just everything. And whereas one of the geniuses of the Vajrayana is that in that mandala, you get bored with one thing, you can concentrate on something else.
Yeah.
The whole thing is pure. And that's hard for us to accept, that there's like a hierarchy. Some objects of meditation, that seed syllable is, in my view, a superior object of meditation. You can come to enlightenment looking at a stone. I don't doubt it. But there's power in that seed syllable. Yeah. And that's, that's a thing of faith. But, this wonderful Englishman who wrote, can't remember these John Blofeld, he's passed away now, but was a British diplomat in Thailand and wrote books on Buddhism and his own experience. He spent many years in China, met Tibetans and Mongolian lamas when he was in China in like the 1930s. But his book, I can't remember what it's called here, but the title of it in England was The Way of Power. And I think it's true. But anyway, I interrupted you. Forgive me.
No. I had an important second question and I forgot what it was, so I'll go to the 84,000. It's when you were talking about the 84,000 kalpas, and you an arhat gets through those before the light of, what is it?
The Buddha appears to his mind.
The Buddha appears
and
to
light
his
comes
mind,
from the Buddha's heart to his heart.
and then he goes on the bodhisattva path.
Yeah. And quickly on the bodhisattva path, though. It's not wasted.
There's 84,000 teachings, and the reason there's 84,000 teachings is because it covers all of the different emotional, afflictive, different types of nature of mind.
Yeah.
And 84,000 might just be like an arbitrary number. I know it's
symbolic. Yeah.
It's symbolic, and it's based off of, if you divide it by 3, that number is something, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But what it kind of said to me was that as an arhat, if you can develop through all of the kleshas and rest in the nature of mind, then that would be a good point to, what this is saying to me is, then the Buddha appears to you, and then it doesn't necessarily mean a billion years, like 84,000 kalpas, or whatever that is.
Right.
It's to me, it's just like symbolism to overcoming all of the obstacles.
Yes.
Inner, outer.
Yes. And it's like, like they say, a billion Buddhas on a dust mote. Yeah. It's just inconceivable, and it's a mistake to think of this in some sort of literal scientific thing.
I mean, you can though, because there's past, present, and future.
Yes.
But it's the mind that makes it overwhelming.
That's right.
So if you're thinking of past, present, and future in terms of kalpas and all that, it can seem overwhelming, but also, I mean, it still is kind of overwhelming, actually, even if you take all the time away and you look at it as the kleshas,
Right.
because they're innumerable, right?
Right. They're innumerable and
So-
overwhelmingly numerous.
Yeah.
I mean, your ordinary way of doing things is not going to do it. No amount of good works in a worldly sense,
Yeah.
no amount of, whatever correctness is out there, no amount of therapy, only this sort of jumping into the nature of our mind, which to us right now seems kind of like, well, to the worldly being doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
And so that's why they think, you're just believing some pie in the sky or something.
Actually, this leads to the second question that I forgot about, and it was when they were talking about in the book, you're in shamatha or vipassana meditation, and you're focused on one thing, and then the sound of a car backfiring happens, and you can just put your focus on that, or a car horn or whatever music, and you can just keep changing focus as long as the practice of calming the mind is the goal,
Mhm.
is the objective, that you don't get sidetracked from that.
Right.
To me, that's different than what we do in Vajrayana, where we're deep in meditation, and no matter what's going on, it doesn't
Right.
penetrate the bubble.
Right.
Not that we're blocking it out or anything, because that's a different thing. But
Right.
so, my question is that a way, because we practice on a cushion, and we always talk about applying practice to the day-to-day life, is that a way of applying it? So when you're walking around, all of the distractions can become a way of liberation. And I almost feel like, because I heard that, there's almost a connection right now for me on how to do it while I'm out and about in the day.
Yeah, it's profound mindfulness practice. So normally when we think of mindfulness practice, we think of, meditation, sitting and all that, and being mindful, all of that. Yeah. And the definitions, the remembering, and all these things. But it's really true. You can make your mindful practice your entire day. And then you can kind of see how it kind of like bleeds into pure vision.
Yeah.
So that's different than like, we do deity practice and everything, and in part of the teachings, it's like you have acquired this high level if you're walking around and everything is a pure land and everyone is a deity or the deity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a Western society, I mean, that's an admirable goal to have and everything, and I'm shooting for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm here. But just hearing this on just when I'm walking up the stairs here, or like getting a pizza, or leaving work or whatever, watching a baseball game, it's I'm not looking at the baseball players as their deities,
Right.
but I could be focused, and if I notice that focus, is that part of calming the mind?
Absolutely. And also you see there's no karma in that. It's like this, it's like it said, instead of the body and all the things going on, it's just the feeling of the body. It's so hard because we're so living in everything else, not the core. And it also, you start to appreciate, at least in a conceptual way, the profundity of just basic practice on the mind. And so to know that the conventional Mahayana is coming out of that, and then further the Vajrayana out of that, it's not a rejection of what came before. In fact, it's like looking more deeply into it. And that's mind-boggling. And so the same thing with, the motivation. I mean, again, motivation for other beings It's just completion, rather than this focus on the self. But again, the fundamental basic practice is so profound, and that's what the Buddha was teaching. I mean, these people, you read the stories of them coming to enlightenment, they just sat down and meditated with them for 5 minutes, and there they were. They lived in this culture, and they're talking about distraction and stuff. They ain't seen nothing yet, baby. Look at us.
Well, I mean, you feel it in the. I mean, you feel. Sorry about that. You feel it in the when you're with Garchen Rinpoche for a retreat, and ultimately, if you're there long enough, you get to sit with them at least once, and in a meeting or over lunch, or talk with them, or just him being in the same room, walking by all the time. The whole, for lack of a better term, vibe of the whole area is different, and you're literally in a mandala.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like I'm enlightened when I'm there, but I feel that I felt things. I'll just leave it at that.
And those insights, again, in the context of the teachings, it's like whatever experience one has, one can have profound experiences, and the Lama will say, yeah, that's good. You use it for your inspiration, and now burn it. So we don't attach to that either. But the significant thing, and I think for all of us as Americans, because I mean, really, who's going to be out in a hut? I mean, there's some people who do a 3-year retreat. That's great. But even there, we still have our own cultural conditioning. And there's nothing magic about a 3-year retreat. I mean, it's all about your mind. Easy for me to say I haven't done a 3-year retreat, but from my own limited experience, the retreats that I've done, any kind of some sort of experience, it shows you that this sort of ironclad bubble that we live in is not ironclad. And so Nagarjuna said that even the word shunyata, even the word emptiness, destroys samsara. Because even the concept that maybe, maybe this isn't the whole thing as we perceive it, or maybe there's more, or whatever, you know what I mean? So it's like Lama Tarchin taught about, the practice of awareness in Dzogchen. He says, make your mind like a cotton ball and just rest it on whatever the particularly strong negative emotion is. And just rest it there and just do that. He said, it might take years. Who knows? People are different. And even that's not a value judgment on anybody. But it can happen that the negative feeling dissolves. And then for the first time you realize, oh my goodness, even though in your daily life that negative feeling is still kicking you around all the time, at the same time you've experienced it dissolving. So you've seen in its nature, it is not some sort of, you've got power over it, so to speak. Even though we choose not to use our power, or we're still lost, whatever. So that's amazing. So for instance, there's a story in Vietnam of a monk who came to his teacher, and they were practicing Buddha Amitabha's Pure Land. And he said, Master, is the Pure Land real? And the teacher said to him, is this real? Our assumption over and over and over again. My suffering is absolutely real, and I am this, unexamined stuff. So I know the basic, simple practices, I shouldn't say simple because they're obviously profound. And I say simple, I can't do them.
On that out this weekend, they're direct.
Yes.
Like, the basic.
Right.
Things. You're not even thinking about all such beings and how direct it was and how it related to elaborate practices like Vajrayana.
Right. Right. So we're getting the essence again and again and again and again. So again, Kala Rinpoche, 3 trips to the United States, I think in the late 60s, early 70s. First time he taught shamatha and vipassana, simple self-liberation practice. Second time he came, his second tour, he taught Tonglen as the essence of the Mahayana. And the third time he taught, I believe, Mahamudra. Wonderful.
I just had a couple
Yeah.
observations. Just it harkens me back to the beginning of when I started my path, and like the thought that like I was kind of fumbling at this newfound way of dealing with the world and fumbling toward ecstasy, and I had no idea what I was doing, and gradually kind of got closer and closer to understanding a little tiny bit of it. And then there was that retreat that you did, Frank, which was Calm and Clear with Lama Mipim's book. And it was like, oh, shamatha, vipassana, going into the nature of emptiness, when you did the exercise where you took
Right.
us through the body,
Right.
and really looked at that,
Yeah.
and that was for me the beginning of understanding, the Hinayana and the thoughts of that's like I was just kind of floating around, and then I was like, oh, okay,
Right.
I kind of get it. So that was like for me a really super important like moment, because I could grasp onto what I needed to get to that point of that calm and clear place.
Yeah.
And so like if anybody's ever not read the book or not done that wonderful retreat with you, it's super great.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
So.
Lama Mipam was a student of Pato Rinpoche, and this great commentary that we often use, Khenpo Pelden, on Shantideva's great work. And when you start really getting into it, these are some of the great figures. And of course, that's why all of this stuff, because you never know what's going to work for someone, or the time. We're all on an individual path. It's not destroying our individuality at all. And yet you put all this stuff out there because you never know what's going to work for someone. And you can surprise yourself because, when you stop, it's the sincerity. Because when you're trying to get experiences, they will never happen. It's when you stop trying to do that and you're just practicing according to the text, proper motivation. But even I just want to save my own skin, self-liberation, nothing wrong with that. You see your self-interest in these things. That's good. And you can be surprised. Yeah.
And now I have the microphone. I showed up a little late, but what I did catch at the end there about the practice of the four attentions there really resonated with me. And what both Pat and Robert had to say was right on with what I'm about to say, which is it kind of brought me back to the beginning of my spiritual path. Before I really explored anything about Buddhism or about anything like this, I kind of came across these practices in like a generic mindfulness format, and I've been doing basically what's described right there, focusing on your sensations and your body and outward sensations and whatever the third one was.
Yeah, right. Right.
For years.
Right.
Not very consistently or very well, but trying for years. And like Robert said, I think it really could be a valuable tool for daily life in every moment, every single day. That's what we're all striving for, is to find some type of practice that allows you to be in that focus on, all the time. Yeah.
The craziness of our ordinary existence is that we're not even living with what we've got. We're living in reactions to what we've got. I mean, it's just like the saddest thing you can see in the sense of how compassion is generated. 'Cause, you just realize it's just so funny.
It is a funny thing.
Yeah. It's Lama Tarchin would say, if it weren't for the suffering, it'd be very funny.
Still is kind of.
Still, because when you can just rest in that first meditation of just the feeling of I am the body, if you can stay there without getting involved with the drama, first of all, that's closer to reality than what most people are doing. Most people are running on, they think that they're whatever they think. I don't know what they think. They're not thinking. They're not thinking. In fact, one Buddhist teacher said that what people do is not thinking; they do thoughting. We're just like living in our thoughts. The conventional teachings teach you how to think, and that's really, really helpful. And of course, it's intimately involved with wisdom comes, and I'm not saying wisdom with a capital W, but I mean any kind of understanding. You naturally have compassion. So the example that I've given is that, if you're a single mother, I think of some of my clients out there struggling with welfare, all the stuff that they're going through. They meet another woman in that situation. There's immediate, because they've had the experience, complete understanding. And it's not like, I hate to say it, but I've seen in interfaith groups in church where there's kind of down the nose compassion. I'm up here, I'm going to be compassionate towards you. Completely upside down. The Dalai Lama says that's not compassion. Compassion is looking up to the sentient beings. I'm here in this precious human body with this chance to liberate myself and others. Why? Because you went through all the bullshit that you went through. You gave birth to me. You sort of kept me going. All of this stuff. It's a totally different attitude. It's completely humble. One Pure Land teacher said is that, the whole world is trying to be on top of the mountaintop. And we even use spiritual metaphors about that. But he said, actually, the great practice is in the valley. That's where all the stuff breaks down, the minerals, the organic stuff, and all the organic, the rich, fertile stuff is in the valley.
Yeah.
That's where you want to be.
I like how you just described that. Yeah. Or whoever you're quoting described it.
Taitetsu Uno.
One last thing I'll add is just, I'm glad I showed up.
You're good. Good.
Yeah.
Happy to be
even
here.
if I'm not here for very long, it seems like it's a good thing. So,
yeah.
You want to add anything, Gretchen, or should take the microphone?
All right, we can conclude then. Yeah.
Okay, anybody online there have a question? Otherwise, are we ending, Frank?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we'll see you next week. And
Okay.
did you all get a message? Have you gotten messages or heard from last week what texts Frank is reading from? Because if you didn't, send me an email or a text or something, and I'll.
Right.
It's Kala Rinpoche's Profound Buddhism, which is probably out of print, but you can still get it. We found it at Namse Bangso bookstore down at KTD, and there were a few used copies on Amazon.
Yeah.
And there's that PDF you shared on the email, which is what I was using.
Right, and there's a PDF I can share with you that Jackson sent us. So let me know. And then the other one is the Michael Carithers. It's Michael Carithers. Right?
Yeah, Michael Carithers.
Carrithers.
And what's the title of it, Pat?
What's the title?
The Buddha.
Oh, the title is The Buddha.
It's the story of the Buddha's life.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a kind of short book, isn't it?
The Buddha's life.
On the Buddha's life.
Yeah, short is part of the title.
No.
I can't remember it, but it was a short something.
Yeah.
Buddha.
Short history. Maybe.
What?
Pat's looking. There are different editions
Pat's
of
looking
it.
at it. She has a copy. She found a copy.
But Michael Carithers, that'll do it.
Michael Carithers.
We'll post it.
So,
All right.
okay.
So we'll do a short dedication. We dedicate this evening for the benefit of all mother sentient beings. And through our practice of bodhicitta, we actually liberate ourselves. And may we never forget the tremendous blessings that we have received as stumbling onto this path. And may all sentient beings be happy forever. Svaha. Okay. All right.
Gretchen, some tips. Are the one sitting at the computer? Who's sitting at the computer? Anybody?
Gretchen is.
Who is?
It's Gretchen.
Oh, yeah. When you shut down the Zoom session, it wants to convert what it's recorded into something normal. It takes maybe a couple of minutes. So if you can wait a couple of minutes before you shut the computer off, the screen will blank out once it's done.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Good
thanks.
night.
Good.
Disembodied voice from the beyond.
Right, isn't that great? So Cameron, I don't know if you heard, my granddaughters are watching old reruns of Lassie.